David Pietrusza, what was it about the 1920, 1948, and 1960 presidential elections that made you write books about them?
It all starts one step at a time. And the 1920 election, I had been playing around with factoids and just about presidents and presidential elections. And I looked at that one and I started calculating the math. And it was like 1961, you had like really, or 64, you had one president involved, Lyndon Johnson. Mostly you'd get three. You'd get Kennedy and Nixon in 1960 and 68. You'd get Nixon and you would get Reagan. So you might get three, you'd usually get two, but in 1920, you have six. You have
six
Wilson.
U.S. presidents?
You have six in contention in one way or another, although several people have said, but TR's dead. Yes, I know that. But if he's not dead, he is the nominee and he is the President of the United States. Wilson, he's sick, he can't. But he sends his Secretary of State to the convention to stampede the convention. A bad idea.
He wanted the nomination?
He wanted the nomination. And of course, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover wins two Democratic primaries. FDR is on the ticket as the vice presidential candidate. And so you've got this hook. And you've got so much else going on with the League of Nations and every other thing. And 1960, well, we move on from that to where you have three Titanic personalities. We don't have six, but we've got three of the biggest name brands in presidential personalities ever. Kennedy, Nixon, Johnson, and so very, very different. So very, very different ambitions in terms of dynastic or just personal, and something which I think resonates so much with folks who are reading books today. 1948, that's the great cliffhanger. And we love to listen to the experts. We love to get the weather reports, and they're always wrong, and the polls are always wrong, and the experts are always wrong, and by God, we love it when we're smarter than they are. And it turns out we can look back in hindsight and see how wrong they were in 1948. And they saw that election night, and with the Supreme Court, we see that people are reminded of that Dewey defeats Truman thing with the Supreme Court health care nomination, where not only the Chicago Tribune, the Fox News, but the New York Times, CNN, got the headline wrong real quick.
Well, David Pietrusza, to go back to 1920, Herbert Hoover won two Democratic primaries?
Yes, New Hampshire and Michigan. He had some trouble deciding what he was. He had been raised as a Republican. There weren't a lot of Democrats in his hometown of West Branch, Iowa. He said the only one he could remember was the town drunk, which was very illustrative to him as to what the parties were about. But also he'd been a progressive. He had been a progressive for TR, and some of those folks switched over to Woodrow Wilson. He had been a member of the Wilson administration as domestic food administrator. He had gone with Wilson to Versailles. I think John Maynard Keynes said he was the only guy who came out of that conference with his reputation enhanced. And he is a great admirer of Wilson after that. He writes a book called The Ordeal of Woodrow Wilson. So he could have easily flopped to the Democratic Party that year, but he says, look, you've got the Democratic Party is composed of three wings: Southern reactionaries, big city crooks, and agrarian nuts. And he says, I don't want any part of them. And I think he also didn't want to be part of a bloodbath where he would be carrying the flag for a party which was going down in flames that year.
In your book, 1920, The Year of the Six Presidents, published in 2007, you write, Republicans faced an unprecedented problem in 1920. Their logical candidate was dead. The Democrats' difficulty was even worse: a living president who would not get out of the way.
Absolutely. That's Woodrow Wilson. He decides he's going to... He'd been a great orator. He was a great orator. You take a look at Woodrow Wilson, you see those silent films of him. He's got this thin face. He looks almost like that caricature that they used to do of the fellow, the blue nose, who was in favor of prohibition, that puritanical guy. So he looks like he's going to be a very reedy voice, but you listen to the recordings and he's got a great baritone voice. And that is what made his reputation as a speaker, as a fellow who could convince crowds. He says he's going out there again. He has the stroke in Pueblo, Colorado, comes back, is an invalid, but he never tells anyone he's not running again. The premier candidate, the real front runner, is the former Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, who had helped put together a lot of the progressive agenda. The Federal Reserve had helped avert a big stock market crash at the beginning of World War I, took over the running of the railroads and the war economy with the war. And the problem is he's the boss's son-in-law. He's Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law. He didn't marry the boss's daughter, but he got to get the Secretary of the Treasury. He is the Secretary of the Treasury. He is a big deal before that, but now he's family. And he can't make the move unless Wilson gets out of the way. And Wilson never gets out of the way, which blocks it for him. And so you get this deadlock at the convention between him, another cabinet member, A. Mitchell Palmer, who, not being family.
This is on the Democratic side. Yes,
Democratic side, is not shy about announcing his candidacy, but no one particularly wants him. And so it goes to James M. Cox of Ohio, who's a sort of a dark horse, kind of sneaks in when there's a deadlock, because there's a lot of deadlocks for the Democrats in that era, and really does not do well, cannot swim against that tide that year.
What was Woodrow Wilson's reputation at the end of his second term with the American people?
Pretty awful on all ends of the political spectrum. Certainly the stand-pat Republicans or Democrats had not been in favor of him, but the progressives, progressives, the liberals, had been turned against him, I think because of the repressiveness of the war. You take a look at the statement by Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party candidate for president that year and several years before that, who was in Atlanta penitentiary for violation of the Sedition Acts or the Espionage Acts, whichever. And he will say that Woodrow Wilson is alienated from the hearts of the American people at that point. Is a very tragic figure. But more than that, more than recoiling from the war, and this is a common theme in 1920 and 1948, those books. And any time you have an administration which gets us into a war, fights a war, it may be successful, but the American people, any people, will turn against it. 1920 with Wilson, with the Republicans winning the Congress in 46, Lyndon Johnson not being able to succeed himself in 68, with the Bushes. This happens over and over again. 1945, it happens to a very hell of a good war leader, Winston Churchill. So there's a problem with that, but more than that, if add one more gigantic thing to it, it's the economy, stupid, and the economy is a mess. There's more strikes than ever in American history.
This is in 1920?
1919, 1920. You've got that Boston police strike with Calvin Coolidge. You've got the Seattle general strike. So you think that the world is about ready to blow up after the war. And the unemployment rate, the inflation rate are terrific. We would easily be satisfied with what's going on now rather than have that.
In 1919, 1920, was it a given, or was it general thought that whoever won the Republican primary would win the presidency?
Yes, I think so. I mean, you'd have to be dreaming to think as the year went on that the Democrats could pull it off. And there is this massive, massive landslide. So if it's not Theodore Roosevelt, now Theodore Roosevelt, the Republican Party splits wide open in 1912. That's how Woodrow Wilson gets in. Woodrow Wilson, I think, has what, 43% of the popular vote that year. I think he gets less of a percentage of the popular vote in 1912 than William Jennings Bryan does in getting killed in 1908 or something like that, or against McKinley, one of those years. It's really a low turnout, but the party heals itself in 1916, comes damn close to winning.
TR becomes a Republican again?
That TR is a Republican again. It's all very grudging, but the party comes together enough where Charles Evans Hughes goes to bed thinking he's the president-elect, and he ain't. And Woodrow Wilson